The signing of agreements on labour stability and a national minimum wage is postponed until further notice. Labour Federation COSATU has rejected the minimum wage, saying it would not consult with its National Executive Committee. President Jacob Zuma was supposed to sign the wage agreement but backed out at the 11th hour, and this sparked questions that he was opposed to Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, who only yesterday had touted benefits of the wage agreement. Ramaphosa brokered the minimum wage deal between government, business and labour at the National Economic Development and Labour Council NEDLAC in December. The parties agreed on a 20 rand per hour wage to take effect from May 2018.
We compete with a number of other medium-income countries, but when you have a closer look at the real structure of our economy, apart from the fact that it is monopolized, we find that the working people in our country are the working poor. They earn an income, but the income that they earn is so low that they can be regarded as the working poor. That out of the 16 million people in our country who work, 8 million of them earn less than 4,000 rand a month.
The postponement also sparked a possible rift in the tripartite alliance. This is after COSATU rejected the 20 rand per hour wage and accused the ANC of failing to implement its policy to transform the economy. COSATU says a minimum of 20 rand per hour instead of a blanket 3,500 rand monthly pay may lead to a cut in hours for employees. The Federation accuses the ANC government of failing to implement its policy to radically transform the economy. The wage won't have an impact on 47% of workers, and 20 rand per hour is a spectacular failure to transform the labour market. COSATU says the minimum wage should start at 4,500 rand per month. COSATU says government is snubbing the Federation by allowing business to have its way.
When we went to NEDLAC to engage, we had a mandate from the workers, and the mandate was 4.5. Now, this falls short of that in a sense that if you look at people who work 40 or 45-hour week, so they are not going to be able to make that 4.5. Secondly, this does open a number of questions, especially with regards to the loophole surrounding the manipulation of hours. So it means that employers who want to get out of the minimum wage can actually manipulate workers and make sure that no employee actually works that threshold of 40 to 45-hour week.
At this point, it's not clear to me why exactly they decided to withdraw their decision. I think if they are scrapping the idea of a national minimum wage in toto because they're concerned about the plight of the more than 9 million unemployed people in South Africa, and considering the fact that the country's economic growth forecast is dismally bleak for the next year, then I think the decision should be applauded and they should be congratulated. If, however, they're only concerned about the narrow vested interests who've expressed their dissatisfaction at the level that the proposed national minimum wage is that what NEDLAC put on the table, then I think we should all be really, really concerned.
And joining us live in studio is Tony Healy, is a labour consultant, Dr. Azar Jamin as a chief economist with Econometrics, and we'll have Sizwe Pamla, COSATU spokesperson. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us. Let's just start with you, Dr. Jamin, in the sense of looking at the benefits of a minimum wage of around 4,500 rand. I mean, between you and me, would probably spend that in a blink of an eye.
Of course, for the for a minority of South Africans, it doesn't amount to very much money. But yet, for a large proportion of the population, it does represent a sizable improvement on what they sometimes get in the market. At the same time, one must bear in mind that relative to the people who are unemployed, it's a huge income. So it really depends upon where your starting point is as to how good or how bad that level is. And from what I understand, 20 rand per hour or 3,500 rand per month, they kind of come to the same thing. It's what the trade unions have been asking for is 4,500 rand a month. And from what I gather, that is not being accepted by the employer community.
All right, but just again, looking at the impact that 4,500 rand would have on the poorest of the poor, with about 60% of poor working class earning under 3,000 rand. So now if you have a family of 5, for example, and just based on the living standards in terms of inflation and the cost of goods, this would make a significant impact to the poor.
It probably would make a significant impact on those who are fortunate enough to continue working after they've received that big increase. The big fear that some people have is that the moment these workers are granted a much higher wage, the employers will find it necessary to shed some of their workforce and to mechanize, so that you will end up with less employment. The analysis, though, empirical analysis, suggests that the answer of how much people will benefit and how many people will lose their jobs depends very much on the sector that you're looking at. In areas such as mining and manufacturing, it will hardly make any difference because most of the workers are already earning well above that level. But in areas such as agriculture or domestic work, you could see a lot of people losing their jobs because employers would then no longer be able to employ them. Employers who are currently paying them less than that would no longer be able to afford to employ them at the higher wage.
Dr. Dlamini, I just want to also involve Tony Healy. He is a labor consultant. Tony, whether you agree with Dr. Dlamini that, of course, this would lead to job losses, especially for those that are currently employed. But how equitable are we paying for the value of work that we're getting? If you look at the role that a domestic worker plays, for example, somebody whom you entrust with your life, your secrets, and also, the livelihood of your children, and yet we can't find it in ourselves to even increase slightly without threatening job losses.
Well, yes, I think that is an argument, but one must remember as well that we live in a society and a country where we have very high unemployment, and the question is, what impact, if any, will a minimum wage have on the fact that we have unemployment probably bordering realistically on 30 to 40%. So that's where the tension lies. In that, yes, one can argue that that's insufficient to sustain a family. The other argument says, but there's 3 or 4 out of 10 South Africans unemployed at the moment, and if they were to receive that kind of income, it would bring them at least out of bring them more out of the poverty that they experience presently.
But Dr. Dlamini, we've had this argument so many times that we're in a sluggish economic growth with joblessness increasing, existing jobs not necessarily being replicated, or new industries not coming forth. This perpetuates that slave wage mentality, because we know that the poor of the poor are largely or predominantly black, and that the value of their labor is not being appreciated. The mold has been set historically, and it's very unlikely to change unless government intervenes and sets the minimum wage, as we've seen with farm workers and other menial laborers.
Well, if you mentioned farm workers, the outcome of setting a minimum wage in that sector was hundreds of thousands of farm workers losing their jobs. So, and that is factual. We've seen the data produced by the government itself. So that is one example of where the introduction of minimum wages did actually cost a lot of jobs. I totally accept the fact that this is a legacy, historical legacy of the apartheid system. But, if you're really going to tackle it, the way to tackle it is from the bottom up. And that is to educate the working class properly so that they become more employable, they become more productive, and they can start commanding jobs that actually produce more than they are currently doing at present, in such a way as to justify them earning higher incomes than they are doing at present. To start playing around with minimum wages is really attacking the symptom of the problem rather than the underlying causes of the problem.
Yeah, Mr. Healy, just your response to that historical legacy that we're sitting with, and how, without government intervention, we know that in the workplace the complexion would not have changed had it not been for policy reform, as it were. So how do we deal with the issues of inequality, the disparities when it comes to incomes, and also the fact that labor is treated as a dime a dozen? You know, you dispose of one, there's another auntie that's likely to want the job at a lower cost.
Well, there have been various initiatives to address the inequality from the past and the consequence of the unfair discrimination over time. So we have employment equity legislation, for example, which addresses the elimination of unfair discrimination, excuse me, and the introduction of affirmative action. We also mustn't forget that when it comes to minimum wage legislation, we already have hundreds of thousands of employees that are subject to minimum wage legislation in other with regards to other areas in our law. So we have bargaining council agreements that provide minimum wages. We have sectoral determinations which provide minimum wages. And if you look at the 3,500 Rand number, that's probably on par with the existing minimum wages that are already set by government in those other pieces of legislation. So for government to have gone much higher than 3,500 Rand now would have to some degree have resulted in them losing face, because it wouldn't have correlated very well with their existing minimum wages in many other sectors.
But I mean, what's the offset here? There doesn't seem to be a trade-off. It sounds more like businesses saying, look, don't raise the wages because it's going to cost current jobs. But there isn't a trade-off to say, in exchange, to deal with the unemployment issue, we are willing to create these particular possible job prospects, Dr. Jamin. So it is essentially a stagnant process that we're going through.
It is a stagnant process, but again, I have to reiterate, the only way you're going to get employers to want to create more jobs is to provide them with the incentive to do so. And by setting a minimum wage, you are actually creating a disincentive in many sectors. As I say, not all of them, but in many sectors. It's a very artificial way of trying to deal with the problem of inequality. We need to look at the fundamental causes of inequality, and there are many of them. I have mentioned what I believe is one of the key ones being inequality in education. But there are many others. And we're seeing this worldwide at the moment, the way the system at the moment is creating more and more inequality. To try and counter it just by setting a standard minimum wage across all sectors at the same level is really hammering a problem without actually looking deep down at what is causing it.
All right, let's get a voice from Solipidwe, a Deputy General Secretary for COSATU in the Northwest. Repidwe, thanks so much for joining us. We have economists and labor consultants saying that this is essentially dealing with the symptoms of a deeper-rooted systemic problem when it comes to job creation, and that the minimum wage in itself was not necessarily the best remedial action.
Come again, you're saying, what is this saying?
Repeat, I'm saying that whether you agree or not with the minimum wage set, we thought that Cyril Ramaphosa, Deputy President, had lauded this as the greatest intervention to deal with the issue of poverty and salary inequality, rather. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, no, we agree that the issue of the national minimum wage in South Africa is long overdue. And this is one of the issues that COSATU, in one of its living wage bargaining conferences, dealt with this matter, and we've been battling for this country to have a minimum wage for some decades now. And then I think at a time when the President and the Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa announced that this country is going to have a national minimum wage, all of us, we celebrated. And as COSATU, because we're at the forefront of fighting for the national minimum wage, we're very happy. And people must understand there's a difference between a national minimum wage and a living wage. So the issue around the current state that the national minimum wage is going to bring job losses in South Africa and all those things is not true. We have been facing with a number of challenges, particularly the triple challenge of inequality, job losses, and poverty in South Africa. where people are not paid equally and all those things. That's another issue that as COSATU we're dealing with in relation to equal work, equal pay. So we're great at the national minimum wage, long overdue.
All right, but just clarity, because we're expecting a signing ceremony to enforce the minimum wage of 20 Rand per hour. If you calculate it over a 4-week period, that gives you roughly about 3,200 on an 8-hour day per week. So what is it that led to COSATU not signing on this deal?
That's precisely the reason why one of the reasons that we did not sign. If you recall correctly, that the National Congress decision was about 4.3, 5.5. I mean 4.5, 5.3. And in the last CEC in November, we presented the position that was presented by the expert. Around the position of the expert was 3.5. And the CEC gave the national office bearers with the negotiators a mandate to continue to negotiate. Now, we said we can't go and sign before our constituency get a briefing. Where does the issue of the 20 Rand per hour comes from? Whether does it meet our requirement or not? It's something that we wanted to discuss firstly with the Central Executive Committee. It is on that basis that COSATU we did not feel feel comfortable to go and sign before we can give information to our constituency and get a mandate. There's a number of issues that are in that package which you can't go into details part in the media before we can get that mandate.
All right, Peter. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We do have a caller, Jake in Johannesburg. Good evening to you, and what's your question or perspective?
Hello, Cindy.
Hi.
The problem with this minimum, in a sense that.
Jake, just move around a little bit. Your line is not very clear.
Okay. Let me put it this way. Let me say I can only give my wife, let's say, I can give my wife 8 months.
No, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Jake. Yeah, it's not working. Hey, try again.
Okay. Let's say with my income, I can only give my wife 8,000 a month.
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. Then the minimum wage is so high that it cannot be, let's say, my wife can remember that money, 8,000. I still have 2 children that must go to school, blah, 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 everything. Then the minimum wage, should this means all the money that I'm giving to my wife means it must go to my helper. How will that work out?
All right. Thanks so much, Jake. I think what you're raising is pretty much the consensus in that, you yourself, if your income hasn't increased based on either your responsibilities or cost of living, CPI, etc., it would be difficult to retain your helper. But Repetwe, so just for clarity, so this is not a case of whether President Jacob Zuma is not approving of the deal because Cyril Ramaphosa is the one that has been championing the minimum wage. It is essentially about rands and cents when it comes to COSATU not signing this deal. Repetwe? Yes, did you get the question?
No.
Just for clarity, so this is not a standoff between President Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa, who's been championing the minimum wage deal, as it were. It has to do with rands and cents that you're not agreeing on the current amount.
No, it's not a question that we're not agreeing to everything. I want to repeat what I said. We are a trade union movement. We're a trade union federation. We work with constituency. We work with mandate of the workers. So it's not about who is who here. We are asking the president or the Republic of South Africa or the deputy president not to and everybody who has been involved, allow us to go back to our constituency. The issue of the rents and cents is something that's still going to be debated by the Central Executive Committee of COSATU. If the Central Committee of COSATU says you have negotiated from this level to this level, then can you go back and do 1, 2, 3, 4? We'll go back.
All
but
right,
we are not throwing away the whole agreement. The whole agreement, there are issues that are very important in that agreement. But we are saying allow us to go to the constituency and feedback to them so that we must able to table the entire agreement, not an agreement in a piecemeal. All
right, Rep Peter, thanks so much for your time. Anonymous in Durban, good evening to you and thanks for calling.
Good evening.
What's your comment or question?
My comment is, the government has to give employers an incentive to train people so as to be competent. Because you can't just take anybody off the street and give them a minimum wage when you're not getting any benefit from it. We as employers should be given incentives to train people, and then of course you can give them a minimum wage.
Yeah, but what about the skills levy? Sorry, Anonymous, the skills levy with the SETAs and that where there is a rebate, if you will, for organizations who upskill their labor.
Yeah, I understand that, but we on the open market, you must remember, in the open market, we negotiate with clients also. And the unfortunate thing is because of the unemployment and the labor market, we've got to take sometimes what we get in order to keep our men employed. So we're also negotiating, and when we negotiate with a client, we also take into consideration that our guys are not employed. So it's very, very difficult because the government doesn't just give us work. We are in the open market. So how do we? So in other words, there should be a minimum amount specified for argument's sake in the building trade, so that nothing is negotiated. Then we can pay our men what is due, what is required.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I understand that, you want to comply, but it is difficult in the sense that if government dictates how much you should pay. Correct, I hear you. Thanks for your call. Phineas, hello to you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Hi, Phineas.
Cheers,
hi, Phineas. All right, I think we've lost Phineas here. Mr. Healy, the best practice internationally that we can employ as a country, and especially with emerging markets with similar socio-economical issues that we have, what is the best solution in your view?
Well, you'll find that where similar legislation has been introduced elsewhere in the developing world, that there are mixed and conflicting results in terms of what the impact that has on employment and addressing the question of inequality. The big difference is we have such a high unemployment rate that it's almost incomparable internationally with other BRICS countries, for example. So there is an argument that says that as little as 4,500 Rand might be, it's a lot of money for millions who don't earn anything at the moment. And it might look like a pittance, and maybe a pittance in the grand scheme of things. But if there were another 2 or 3 million citizens earning 4.5 or 3.5 or 4,500 Rand a month, that would make, in their lives, from their current perspective, a very big difference. So it's arguable to a degree that minimum wage legislation ignores the plight of the unemployed.
I suppose there are no straight answers to this debate. Thabo, you're calling us from Mpumalanga. Thanks so much for your call. Good evening.
Yes, how are you, Cindy?
I'm good, thank you. Your question or comment?
The problem here, Cindy, is that in this country, people are greedy. So the employers are greedy. How can one survive with 3,500 a month? You can't even buy your kid anything. You can only buy grocery and the money is finished. The problem here is people must not be greedy and they must pay employees decent salaries, because you find in a lot of places whereby employers give people 1,000 Rand. What can you do with that 1,000 Rand a month? Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. So equal pay for the value of work. Dr. Jamin, we're going to close with you and just taking the debate forward. Should the signing take place of 4,500 Rand, and how the economy and industry will have to absorb this, hopefully without the casualty of job losses?
Look, the one positive aspect about the signing is that hopefully it could just improve industrial relations in the country, and that in itself might reduce some of the volatility in industrial relations that has been harming economic growth. But I do believe that it's a very simplistic solution, and one would have rather liked to see solutions aimed at really addressing the problem of inequality at its roots. And also, even if one were to implement minimum wages, to do so in a way that actually took account of the kind of business that was involved, where the kind of supply and demand for labor conditions that vary so much between one sector and another. There is also a danger that by doing it this way, you're going to see a lot of non-compliance, and then you have another big industry that you've got to create in order to enforce compliance amongst employers, which creates new problems that way. But, you know, we're trying to find solutions that please all sides, and to that extent, maybe it's an interim compromise that might please quite a lot of people.
And that's